Good morning, everyone, and welcome to SCAMP's Writing Past Wrongs panel discussing redlining's casual role in shaping Southern California's communities and movement for land reparations. My name is Kelsey, Director of Business Development and Government Relations for the Jamboree Housing Corporation, but I am also one of SCAMP's newest board members, and I am just so excited to be part of an organization that tackles issues of equity and diversity and reparations as it relates to housing advocacy and policy. So I'm very, very excited to not only moderate today's conversation, but also to actively listen, because we have some pretty great panelists here to share some of their research with you, some of the current advocacy efforts that are happening throughout the state of California, and then to also engage in a discussion around how all of us can be a part of the advocacy work to make housing more equitable in the long run. So thank you again so much for being here. There is a Q&A tab at the bottom left of your screen where you can submit questions. We will be getting to those questions towards the back half of the presentation, but first we're going to engage in a really interesting discussion with our panelists. So without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce the panelists for today. Our first speaker who we'll be hearing from is Dr. Anthony Orlando, who is an assistant professor in finance and real estate law at Cal Poly Pomona. His recent book, Keeping Races in Their Places, The Dividing Lines That Shape the American City, takes a really economic perspective on the issues of redlining and the way that it continues to have effects on a wide variety of issues, from health discrepancies to housing discrepancies today. So really looking forward to our conversation with Dr. Orlando in just a couple minutes. We have some other exciting folks that will be joining us today as well. Mr. Mayor Mitch Ward, the former mayor of Manhattan Beach, California, and the founder of Bruce's Beach Education Foundation in Manhattan Beach, will be sharing with us some of the work that he has been doing in Manhattan Beach surrounding reparations and redlining. Our next speaker will also be Miss Lisa Holder, who will be joining us in just a few moments. She's actually currently sitting in the California State Task Force on Reparations, where as a Los Angeles-based civil rights attorney, she represents as the voices of Southern California folks as an appointed member to that task force. So we're really excited to have her join us and hear more about what the state is looking to do in addressing the historical impacts of redlining for Black Americans in the state of California. And lastly, but definitely not least, we have Tara Borowski, the Executive Director of the Community Corporation of Santa Monica and a fellow SCAMP board member. And we're really, really excited to hear her perspective as to what the affordable housing community's role in addressing these different issues are. So without further ado, we're going to get right into our agenda today with a presentation from Professor Orlando, and then we'll move on to the policy and panel discussion of the movement for land reparations before hearing from all of you. So without further ado, Dr. Orlando, can you go ahead and turn on your screen and mute yourself?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. I will just share a few slides here for the presentation, and I'll try to be cognizant of time because I want to give the most amount of time to the panelists. Thank you for having me today. I want to say two things to start. First, I think it's important by saying that at Cal Poly Pomona, where I work, speaking on behalf of the university, and also I think on behalf of everyone in the webinar today here, we respectfully acknowledge the original caretakers of the land that we're on, the Tongva peoples, and all of their ancestors, elders, and descendants, past, present, and emerging. And we also recognize this land known as Los Angeles County today is home to many indigenous peoples from all over. And we're grateful for the opportunity to live and work here as guests on the land. The second thing I want to say, as Kelsey alluded to a little bit, is my perspective coming into this. Now, I can't talk specifically about lived experience of living through an era like redlining or living through the oppression and the injustices that are happening right now. I'm a social scientist, so my perspective is going to be looking at the data and seeing what story the numbers have to tell us. So I hope that that provides some useful empirical evidence for the conversation that's going to come after from the experts and activists who frankly know a lot more about what's happening in these issues than I do. Let me start by saying why I focused my book specifically on redlining when there are so many forms of housing discrimination. It's not that these other forms are any less important, and I imagine a number of them will come up in the conversation today. A lot of you have probably read the book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, that I think did a great job of really helping the broader American public to understand all these intertwined issues. I focus on redlining for a couple of reasons. One is that it lasted legally long after some of these others were outlawed or ruled as unconstitutional. So restrictive covenants, for example, that are in the deeds of properties, racial restrictive covenants were deemed unconstitutional in 1948. Redlining persisted until the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and I'll show you some evidence that it continues to persist today, even after it was officially outlawed. But the second reason why is because a lot of these forms of housing discrimination focus on laws and on housing specifically. Redlining, I view as being the intersection between those things and finance. It has to do with how money is directed across society. Now, almost everyone who's on this webinar probably knows the history of redlining, but just so everyone's on the same page, let me give a very brief definition. Redlining was the official policy of the US government from the 1930s to the 1960s to direct lenders to invest their capital for affordable mortgage financing in some neighborhoods and not in others. And those directions were explicitly racist, as I'll show in a minute. What we find is that even after the 1960s, we still have what I would call redlining as a philosophy, even after this policy has disappeared. A lot of our markets and our laws continue to direct capital in discriminatory ways, and so the legacy persists. We are indebted, for those of us who are social scientists today, we are indebted to the Mapping Inequality Project to be able to document this long-term legacy. This is a project that was led by the University of Richmond and specifically headed up by a researcher named Robert K. Nelson. And you can visit it yourself, and I encourage you to do so in your free time. You just go to mappinginequality.us. And you can click on any of these cities and you can zero in and see the redlining maps that were drawn in the 1930s, commissioned by the federal government, where appraisers carved up the cities into neighborhoods, into 4 grades, and color-coded them. Green was the so-called best, blue was the next grade, then yellow, and then red. And red was a flashing warning sign to lenders to avoid those areas. They were not legally bound to do so, but there were all sorts of government incentives put in place, maybe the most important of which was that you couldn't get FHA insurance for those loans. As a result, most lenders avoided those neighborhoods throughout this era. Now, I will warn you that when you dive into these maps, you will find some very offensive language. The appraisers were not shy about explaining exactly the reasons why they felt that some neighborhoods should get green grades and others should get red grades. To look at our own Los Angeles maps, the website does a nice job of linking together the maps here, the actual paper maps, and then you can zoom in and they become digitized so that you can click on any neighborhood and you can see the neighborhood where you live or the neighborhood where you work. How were they graded and exactly why back then? You can probably already tell by looking at this map, if you haven't done it already, that it correlates with a lot of differences that we see in our city today. I'm going to dive into 2 specific neighborhoods just as examples, and this is where I have to warn you that the language does get explicitly offensive. Here's a redlined neighborhood, Boyle Heights. Now, not all of the neighborhoods receive a grade. As you can see, a lot of downtown isn't graded at all. Doesn't receive any color. Those are predominantly commercial and industrial areas. So they only graded residential areas. But you can see on the left, the way that the appraisers explained why they gave it a red grade. This is a melting pot area with diverse and subversive racial elements, detrimental racial elements. A lot of us would consider a melting pot area to be a wonderful thing, welcoming all sorts of people. But back then, they considered that to be a reason why it was undeserving of affordable mortgage finance. Contrast that with a green-lined area like San Marino. Now here you don't see anything explicitly about the race, but the language is in there if you look for it. Some of what they talk about is the beautiful natural terrain or the nice buildings that are built there, but then you see things like deed restrictions are of the highest quality. Those are those restrictive covenants. And this again is one of the reasons why redlining matters so much, because restrictive covenants were ruled unconstitutional in 1948. And yet redlining persisted for another 20 years. That means that this neighborhood continued to be treated by lenders the same way that it was treated when restrictive covenants were in place. Even after restrictive covenants are unenforceable, according to the Supreme Court, for another 20 years, redlining freezes that impression. It does not allow these neighborhoods to change. It doesn't specifically allow the redlined neighborhoods, when they gain higher incomes and higher education, and they prove that they are creditworthy, it doesn't allow them to access affordable home ownership. I should point out, by the way, that there's no economic evidence, no justification for the way these maps are written. I'm not going to get into the details here, but in my book, I go into detail to see, is there any economic reason why they can justify that the red line neighborhoods were less likely to repay loans? And I actually find some evidence to the contrary. But for today's sake, let's move on to talk about the effects this had. I love this quote from Jane Jacobs: credit blacklisting maps are accurate prophecies because they are self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say to an area, you will not have access to capital, of course they will have difficulty developing, but then you cannot blame them for the lack of development and say that they don't deserve access to capital. It's an argument that is circular and doesn't make any sense. And they were, in that sense, self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, there are two questions that historians have asked that partly prompted me to write the book. One is, was race actually a significant driver of the maps? Even though the appraisers wrote in there that it was, some statisticians would say, well, they would have drawn the lines in the same place anyway, just based on different incomes, different credit scores, different building quality, and so on. That's actually not the case. We've studied this and we have found that race is a significant factor, even for areas that had similar income, similar building quality, areas that had races and ethnicities predominant that they did not consider to be deserving. They were more likely to receive the red lines. The second is the effects of this. Did the maps actually worsen outcomes, or were they just reflecting discrimination that was already in place? And this matters because it asks the question, does the discrimination along financial means matter? Is discrimination through things like racial covenants sufficient to explain what has happened? Or did the discrimination about where money was allocated, did that actually have a causal effect on how our lives are lived today and how our cities are shaped? And the answer is yes. One of the best ways that we've gotten to try to study this is looking at something called border discontinuities. The idea is this: let's not just compare redline neighborhoods and other neighborhoods. Let's drill down. Let's zero down just to the border between the redline neighborhood and the neighborhood next to it. If you take one house on one side of the street and another house on another side of the street, they are in identical neighborhoods. They are on the same street. They are in the same economy, the same labor market. Their houses are of similar quality to look at. They have everything in common. They're on the same street. The only difference is that the lender will treat the house on this side different than the house on that side. This house will get access to a mortgage and that one will not. This one will be owned and that one will be rented out. And we can see a big jump when you literally just step across the border in ways that can't be explained by anything else. Maybe the first economists to do this were Ian Apple and Jordan Nickerson, so I want to give them credit for this. This is from their paper, but many economists have done it since. And you can see that home prices jump down significantly when you jump from the non-red line side of the line to the red line. And so a lot of the evidence that I'll show you today follows this pattern. Another thing that I found in my research with Brian Ann, who's a researcher at Georgia Tech, and Sieva Rodnyansky, who's at Occidental College, is that redlining changed the perception of risk in these communities. I think one of the myths that's out there is that redlined neighborhoods always had worse outcomes, and that landlords and investors always perceived them as riskier. So what difference would something like redlining make? And that's wrong. Now, this is a little bit of a complicated graph to explain, so let me just boil it down for you. This is looking at differences in what we call rental yields. Basically, how much rent could a landlord extract from a property of a given price? For all the developers out there, think of it as something similar to a cap rate. It's not exactly a cap rate because of data limitations, but something similar. It's a return that the landlords are earning. And in finance, we tend to find that returns are correlated with risk. So when those rental yields jump up, it's because an area is perceived as riskier, that there's not as much competition for landlords to flood in and drive down the yields. What we find here is that in the red line neighborhoods and even in the yellow line neighborhoods, they tended to have lower rental yields before redlining, which means they were perceived as less risky. It is only after redlining that it starts to turn positive. After redlining, these neighborhoods start to be perceived as riskier, and so the rental yields jump up. This is a change that the discrimination of capital has actually affected upon these neighborhoods. And it persists long after, as you can see here, long after redlining is officially outlawed by the Fair Housing Act. So let's talk about why it persists. There are a number of reasons. I want to talk about two specifically. One is something that we identified in that paper with Brian Ann and Siewa Rodniansky, which is something a lot of you will appreciate. The built environment is what economists call durable capital. It's not like building a laptop. It's not like serving a meal. It's not a good or a service that will disappear tomorrow or a few years from now. When you build real estate, it lasts for generations. And so the real estate that we build through the discrimination of capital will result in different neighborhoods that last long after that explicit or official discrimination is off the books. It will result in the types of real estate that have older, less maintained buildings that attract people of lower incomes that wind up with higher segregation, higher poverty, lower collateral, and so on. And we show all of those things in our paper. Another reason is, I've kind of mentioned before, I want to draw this distinction between redlining as policy and redlining as philosophy. Redlining as policy was the official policy that the government had that instructed lenders to follow these maps. But redlining as philosophy is what underlined the maps. It is the idea that it makes sense for us to invest more of society's money in some neighborhoods, but not in others. And the ones that get short shrift are the ones that have always gotten short shrift. That is a very problematic ideology. And I think if we investigate it deeply, we will find that it underlies all sorts of policies, not just the redlining map. I talk about some of these in my book. Hyanga Yamada-Taylor talks about it in her brilliant book, Race for Profit. Let me just give one modern day example where we build affordable housing. A lot of you out there use LIHTC. You know this, the low income housing tax credit. But I will just point it out as an example of how this philosophy persists. There are some LIHTC projects that get built in high income, high opportunity neighborhoods. But where do most LIHTC projects get concentrated? Most of them get concentrated in the areas where they've always been concentrated in. This follows the same philosophy that redlining had, which is that access to opportunity should only be for the folks who can afford to live in the high income neighborhoods. By not allowing affordable housing to be built in wealthier neighborhoods, we are following exactly the ideology that the appraisers laid out for us in the 1930s, even if we don't say it in explicitly racial terms. This results in all sorts of effects that aren't even just economic effects. One of the biggest differences is how can children grow up in these neighborhoods and rise out of poverty and find their way into opportunities in society if our school funding is stratified along the same lines that redlining has always stratified all sorts of funding? And so the finance in education follows the finance in housing. This is a brand new paper by two researchers up at Harvard. On the left-hand side, you can see federal funding. A grade are the green line, the best, quote unquote, best areas. D neighborhoods are the red-lined neighborhoods. Now, our federal government has done a decent job of making sure that more funding per pupil goes to the C and D graded areas than the A and B graded areas, though it's not a large difference at all. But most of the funding in our school system comes from local funding, property taxes that are tied to home values, which are affected by redlining. And as a result, we find that the C and the D graded areas receive far, far less funding per pupil than the A and B graded areas. This probably doesn't surprise a lot of you, but I think it is stark to see it in the numbers. And we don't just see it in the school funding, we then see it in what happens as those children grow up. There has been monumental strides made by Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights team at Harvard University in documenting neighborhood by neighborhood, what is the access to opportunity for children who grow up in different neighborhoods. And I know this is a complicated table, so I'm just going to zero in on a few of them. Here is the percentile rank of the households. What this means is in the A-graded neighborhoods today, households living there have a much higher rank on the income distribution than D-graded areas. Not a surprise, unfortunately, but here's the interesting thing too. The difference is almost as stark for where the children who grow up in those neighborhoods wind up ranking on the income distribution when they turn 29. They grow up, maybe they move away from home, and yet they rank at the exact same place in the income distribution that they did when they were growing up as children. The differences extend beyond childhood into adulthood. And again, just to prove that there is a causal effect here, let's look at that border discontinuity. When you jump from the C-graded side to the D-graded side, literally stepping across the border from living in one house on one side of the street to another house on another side of the street, you go down in the income distribution. It's not a huge amount, but it is significant. And if you extrapolate it throughout the communities, it accounts for a lot of the income inequality and wealth inequality we see in society. Let me just point to two more pieces of data on this table specifically. This is what we would consider upward mobility. If you grow up in the bottom quintile of the income distribution, what are your odds of reaching the top quintile? If you grow up in an A-graded neighborhood in the bottom quintile, your odds of rising out of that to the top quintile are more than twice if you grow up in a D-graded area. And again, just stepping across the border makes a significant difference. And I will say for anybody who's out there as a social scientist, these are statistically significant differences. The last data point I'll point out here, because it matters for the conversation that the panel's about to have, is the differences in credit scores and the differences in subprime lending. You know, even though redlining is officially outlawed today, we still find that there are significant differences in access to mortgage financing. Well, why are there differences if they can't explicitly discriminate? It's because they're allowed to discriminate based on legal means like credit scores, and credit scores are hugely different between redlined neighborhoods and non-redlined neighborhoods. And as a result, subprime lending is much higher in those lower graded areas than in the higher graded areas. And that we saw as a result in the Great Recession, unfortunately. The last piece of evidence that I'll point out before I turn it over is that this is a life or death issue. Here in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can see that the green-lined areas nowadays have a life expectancy of greater than 84 years, while the red-line neighborhoods have a life expectancy of less than 78.8. We're talking about 6 years of extra life from growing up and living in these areas. And we saw that tragically over the last 2 years. The NCRC put out a brilliant report showing how all of these comorbidities of COVID-19, all of these risk factors are significantly higher in the red-line neighborhoods than in the non-red-line neighborhoods. And so it struck most acutely there. I'll conclude with the words of Keeanga Yamada Taylor. In her book, which focuses on the 70s and 80s, she says, we could have built new housing in center cities, in redlined neighborhoods. We could have also built affordable housing in white suburban enclaves for people to move into, and therefore provided equal access to opportunity across both types of neighborhoods. We did not do that. I will add to that, we still have the opportunity to do that. And there is a movement for a lot of these things to change. If there is one lesson from redlining, it is not just that housing discrimination matters, but also that financial discrimination matters. And so all of these movements that target financial practices that discriminate against peoples and against neighborhoods ought to also be a part of this conversation of land reparations. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's been a great honor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Orlando. That was so amazing. I'm going to give our panelists a couple seconds to turn their cameras on before we keep going. And I just want to say that, you know, this is a topic that hits very close to home for me. I am the granddaughter of a Mumford Point Marine, which means my grandfather served when the military was still segregated. And so I grew up hearing all of the stories of what it was like to serve your country, come home, and then not have access to any of the resources, and most specifically, denial to GI benefits that provided housing for veterans and educational opportunities. And, you know, later on in life, a few decades later, my grandfather was honored by Congress with a Congressional Medal of Honor, which was amazing. But I remember sitting there thinking, is this all that we get, is a medal at the end of all of this? And I think that your work is so important in showing that really addressing these issues requires so much more than proclamations and medals, but really requires a systemic approach to how we address years and years of housing policy that purposely excluded Black Americans from the economic and social benefits and health benefits that you've highlighted today. So thank you so much for that thoroughness. And now that I see that everybody's got their cameras on, I'm going to go to Tara first, because I think that she has a really great perspective on, you know, how we do more than just the proclamations and the medals, but how we actually use housing and policy to create change. And so Tara, you develop and own and operate a lot of different affordable housing units across Santa Monica. Can you share with us your perspective on, you know, the council's recent adoption on a right to return policy? And then I would love for you to also touch on how that perspective is shaped a little bit by restrictive covenants and some of, you know, the displacement of the past. That's a big question, so take it in as many chunks as you want.
Sure. Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you, Dr. Orlando. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm actually going to share a little bit about a real life right now example of what Dr. Orlando just talked about. But to start with, we own and operate and develop affordable housing in Santa Monica, specifically because we want to site affordable housing in high opportunity neighborhoods for a lot of the reasons that were just outlined in the presentation about how having lower income families, particularly children, growing up with access to high quality schools, transit, parks, and employment opportunities. So that's specifically what we're focused on. And yes, the city of Santa Monica did recently adopt a right to return policy. And basically what the policy says is that there were two major displacement events that happened in Santa Monica's more recent history. One was redevelopment of the Civic Center area, and then there was the construction of the 10 freeway. Both of these events happened around the 1950s, 1960s. And as you can imagine, it displaced large amounts of families, particularly African-American and Latinx families. And, you know, I think one thing that can be debated is whose responsibility is it, right? Somebody can say, well, it's Caltrans' responsibility, or it's, you know, the state, or it's the local jurisdiction. So that's a topic for a different day. But those two events happened and displaced many people. And so what the city decided to do is to offer, as a way of starting to address things that happened in our community, the opportunity to go to the top of the affordable housing waiting list. And to give you a sense of that, the affordable housing waiting list in Santa Monica right now has probably about 8,000 or 9,000 people on it. So it's a very long list. People want to live in affordable housing in Santa Monica because the rent disparities are just so large, right? So our rents are anywhere from $400 a month to about $1,200, depending on the size of your household and your income level. Whereas, you know, a market rate 1-bedroom apartment is north of $2,500 a month. So you can see right away why affordable housing is so important in Santa Monica and other high opportunity neighborhoods. So this is a pilot program that would allow up to 100 households And it goes all the way to grandchildren. So if your grandparents were displaced by one of those episodes, you can submit documentation, and I guess there would be some kind of a vetting or approval process. Then you basically go to the top of the waiting list behind anybody who is subject to an Ellis Act eviction, which is still the #1 priority. So that's what's been proposed in Santa Monica. And, I can certainly opine on my opinion about it. I will say, I think the value of it is that because the list is so long, it really does give the opportunity for those families who were affected by these incidents to get affordable housing. There's been some recent news pieces, both on NPR and the LA Times, specifically about this topic. And in particular, one person who has been quite vocal, Michelle Monroe, whose grandparents had a home, I think it was a duplex, in Santa Monica that was taken by eminent domain during this time. And, she was quite vocal about the fact that providing affordable housing is not nearly enough of a recompense for what was taken from people. So I think we'll probably dive into that discussion more. But what I wanted to talk about was how it affects affordable housing. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the other things that have happened in Santa Monica and Los Angeles. So as I mentioned, those two, what they call urban renewal projects happened. And I think there are many examples of those throughout LA County. Restrictive covenants were all over LA County. We had worked with public counsel on some legislation I can talk more about later, but I think their estimate was that there about 50 to 60% of the city of LA had some kind of a restrictive covenant on it at one time or another. And I thought it might be interesting for the audience to see an example of this, because we actually are developing now throughout the west side of Los Angeles. So we've expanded a bit beyond Santa Monica. And we have a project we're working on in Westchester. So I am going to share my screen so you can see what one looks like. So this covenant was recorded on a piece of property in Westchester looks like it was like the 1940s. So it's kind of hard to see here, but this is what it looks like. And you can right away see that this is not a 1-paragraph document. This is actually a 6-page document. So one of the things that was discussed about these documents is that it has the blatant language prohibiting people that are not Caucasian, and I'll show you that clause, from living on the property. But what so here you go, here is the paragraph that basically says no person of the white, it cannot be occupied except anybody who, let me say that again. It cannot be occupied not of the white or Caucasian race. And they go further to say that anybody who is Japanese, Chinese, Mexican, Hindu, Filipino, Ethiopian, Indian, or Mongolian are also not Caucasian. So it gets really specific, and it's obviously very disturbing. That part was nullified, as was said in the Supreme Court. But this is a 6-page document, and according to the courts, the rest of this document is valid, no matter that it's completely outdated, almost 100-year-old. These documents still exist. And so if you go to an earlier section, this is a 2-acre parcel in Westchester, which, by the way, has 0 affordable housing. So that's quite telling. And it is the general land use designation for the site is multifamily residential. But this 1920s document basically says that this 2-acre parcel cannot have more than 4 homes on it. So it talks here about what's prohibited, which is you can have a single family residence, 2 or 3 or 4 families, but that's it. So in effect, it's basically restricting any multifamily housing, which as we all know, that is typically where more of the affordable housing is. So right away, you can see the disconnect. And that the worst part about this is in order to remove that covenant, you have to ask everybody in the tract, and in this particular tract, there are 26 property owners, if we can remove our property from the covenant. And you can already guess the answer. They said no. They don't want it removed because they don't want affordable housing in their neighborhood. So this stuff is happening right here and right now. So, to answer your question, Kelsey, more definitely needs to be done. Now, I think the debate is really whose responsibility is it? And certainly, I think we'll get into that conversation later, but I think I will pass it along to other panelists for now.
Well, I'm definitely going to come back to you on some legislative fixes. I wrote it down because that's incredibly shocking to me. And I think you said 70% of the city is covered by these. Okay. Yeah. Well, somebody that's probably a great person for us to pivot to on that state perspective of what can we do. And part of why we have Lisa Holder here with us today is she has been appointed to the State Reparations Task Force, which has been, this group that has been asked to really gain all of this information from experts in the field across a variety of issues, including housing policy, and then be able to really be the body that collects that work, documents it, and then hopefully eventually makes recommendations on what we can do as a state to address the variety of these issues. And it's a very unique process. As Lisa told us on our prep call, we're one of the first states to actually do this effectively. So Lisa, I'm gonna go ahead and have you unmute yourself. And I would love for you to share with the group just about the work that's being conducted by the state task force, some of the goals that it has. And then if you have any thoughts on policies or programs that you hope will come out of the task force, we can also talk about that as a group later on, but would love to hear your thoughts.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Of course.
Thank you all for inviting me here. It's been a pleasure working with you all so far. Yeah, my name is Lisa Holder. I'm a civil rights attorney. And I have been appointed by the governor of California to the first state convened reparations task force in the United States. So there have been there's been a movement for Black reparations since the end of slavery. I mean, we've all heard of 40 acres and a mule. So this is a very, very long-standing movement. We are getting more traction in the policy arena now in that movement, and you're seeing reparations commissions pop up locally across the country. So I'm sure people have heard about land reparations in Evanston, Illinois, and other localities throughout the country. But California is the first state that has actually been able to convene a reparations task force. Other states have tried. They haven't been able to get the votes in their state assemblies and houses to actually do that. From a legislative and policy perspective, I want to also explain why the California task force is unique. This task force is also unique because for decades, there's been a bill in the federal House called H.R. 40. And that is a bill that would require the federal government to convene a task force for Black reparations. And even though that bill has been introduced in the House for probably 3-4 decades now, this is the first year where it's gotten serious traction, where it has passed through most of the chambers and where it is likely to pass in the House and then go on to the Senate. And so California's reparations task force, if we do eventually get a federal bill to have reparations, California's task force is going to serve as a model, likely, for what the federal government will do. So that just sort of situates us. Now let me just get to what our objective is on the task force. The task force will meet for the next 2 years. We sunset in 2023. In our regular meetings, we hear from experts, social scientists, doctors, therapists about all aspects of social injustice around anti-Blackness and historical injustice around anti-Blackness. We have had isolated testimony in a 2-day hearing around the issue of housing and anti-Blackness, where we heard from social scientists, we heard from homeowners, we heard anecdotes from individuals and from economists and people in the lending institutions talking about anti-Blackness in the area of housing. The field of housing contemplates historical and current dynamics of homelessness, redlining, gentrification, and discriminatory lending. And the testimony that we've collected deals with all of those issues. And our witnesses concur that the past, present, and future harm to the Black community in the housing industry is due to the conventions of anti-Blackness. And so we gather all of this testimony, we're putting it into a report, which is probably going to be the largest report on racial discrimination of its kind. It's probably going to be over 1,000 pages, and it will be published for regular people, for scientists, for academics to have access to, and it is going to be replete with the history of discrimination against African Americans. So one of our deliverables will be this report, and it's going to have a lot of impact for posterity in terms of the study of racial injustice and the foundation for reparations, whether it's land reparations or other forms of economic reparations for Black people. The other thing, in addition to the report, we are going to be making a set of recommendations to the legislature at the end of our convening in 2023. And that recommendation will be based on all of the evidence that we have collected and curated from experts and from real people dealing with anti-Black discrimination. So we will make these recommendations to the legislators to deploy different forms of reparations. Land reparations is one of the things that we are very seriously considering, and a lot of our experts have recommended land reparations for the reasons that that Professor Orlando explained. The injustices around housing are one of the major drivers of continuing discrimination and gaps in opportunity. So that really just sort of encapsulates what we do. The last thing that I do want to say is that it is really important that, especially given the novelty of this process and the influence that this first time process could have, from a federal perspective, it's really important for us that we hear from stakeholders, that we hear from the public. And our meetings are public, they are transparent, and we want to invite the public to comment on what they think California reparations should look like, who should be eligible for it, and whether it should be rolled out as cash payments, programs in education, in housing, et cetera, or a combination of that. So I'm going to put in the chat. We are actually meeting at this very moment. I took a break from the meeting to come and talk to you, but I'm going to put in the chat information on how you can access our hearings, and we invite people to come to our hearings and make public comment. We're meeting today and tomorrow, and then we will be meeting throughout the rest of the year as well. So,
well, I love a strong call to action, so we'll make sure that that gets into the chat. And I personally will be attending the meeting tomorrow. I have just want to reemphasize everything that you said, Lisa, about the amount of testimony that you've had come in. And I'm curious, and if you've had a piece of information that's come through the Reparations Task Force that's been particularly illuminating or interesting to you. I know after we spoke originally, I went through some of the resources, and just the amount of testimony and the depth and breadth of the data that you guys are having presented to you all is incredible. So definitely encouraging people to check that out as a resource.
Yeah, I mean, the the information that we've received around the history of racism in housing has been tremendously powerful, tremendously concerning. What has been most illuminating to me is the experts' testimony regarding the current process of gentrification, and that dynamics relationship to historical housing discrimination, including the things that Professor Orlando talked about, and that Tara Bareskas just talked about. So, the process of gentrification that we're seeing right now, which is essentially often a process of Black removal, is very much related to redlining, to restrictive covenants, and to the dynamics that those created early on in the 20th century, and the way that Black people were essentially siloed into certain areas and excluded. But those areas are now the areas that are being economically developed, that are being focused on, and that people who want to make money from all across the world, major multinationals, are now going into those areas, those redlined areas, and trying to leverage the low cost of property to make money. And by doing that spells Black removal. So the little tiny bit that we were able to get in those redline areas, the few developments that we were able to make, the historic Black watering holes that we were able to generate, are being destroyed, are being removed, and Black people are completely being pushed out of these areas. And there's no safety net to ensure that Black people still retain a stronghold in these areas where they may be very historically connected to. And so that is a very, very dangerous dynamic that needs to be disrupted and interrupted. And we, as policymakers, we need to think about ways to disrupt that Black push out from historically Black neighborhoods.
Absolutely. And I imagine we'll come back to that gentrification topic because I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A and there's a couple questions in there. But I think what sticks out to me the most about, Anthony, Tara, and your comments is that there's just so many different pieces of this policy that we can attack it from. But the overwhelming sense that I have gotten from the three of you is the need to be very specific in how we go about addressing these issues, because the original impact and the original sin of redlining was very, very specific to Black people. And so needing to get specific on how our policy solutions address that original impact for sure. And I think that's a great transition to have Mitch turn his camera on and join us for a little bit. Because I know that I have been a Southern California person for quite some time, but I must admit that I had to do some education of myself back in 2020 about Bruce's Beach, because I think a lot of times when we talk about redlining, when we talk about the impacts of housing discrimination, there's a lot of emphasis put on the South and the East Coast, and not so much an emphasis on the fact that California has a long, long history with it as well. So Mitch, thank you so much for being with us here today. And I'm hoping that you can just talk a little bit about the efforts behind Bruce's Beach, maybe for somebody like me that has heard about it, but doesn't know all the specifics, but more importantly, the importance of returning the land to the Bruce family. And what have you found to be some of those political hurdles that can help educate kind of the future efforts we're hoping to do on land reparations?
Thank you very much, Kelsey, for having me. It's a pleasure to be part of such an impressive and informative panel. I'm proud of my role to expose the truth that we exposed in regards to the history of Bruce's Beach here in Manhattan Beach. But there is a spoiler alert here. The Willa and Charles Bruce's descendants are getting their Manhattan Beach property back. And if the property were fully developed with some homes on it, it is estimated that the property would be worth $75 million, the two lots. So I'm very proud of the small role that I had to ensure that our city recognized the history of Willa and Charles Bruce who started here in the city of Manhattan Beach in 1912 when the city was incorporated. And they ran a very successful resort for Black people all throughout that, from Los Angeles County and all the way down to San Diego, would come up to Bruce's Beach here in Manhattan Beach to enjoy the ocean because there was nowhere else on the Pacific here in Southern California that would allow Black people to do so. So I'm very pleased that our city in 2006 was able to rename the park back in honor of Willa and Charles Bruce. You cannot fix what you don't understand or those things that you deny. And a lot of people here didn't understand the history of Willa and Charles Bruce here in the city. And so that was my political hurdle and the task that I had to try to educate the individuals, what I found in the 1990s about Willa and Charles Bruce. Willa was a Black woman entrepreneur that had $1,225 that she bought her property here in Manhattan Beach in 1912. There were 600 residents here when the city was incorporated, and Willa and Charles Bruce were two of those residents. And so I thought it was very good that we had a strong Black woman that was able to buy property here at a time when Black people were not able to buy property. Unfortunately, after 12 years of huge success here in Manhattan Beach with the resort, a young man from Illinois, 24-year-old white guy from Illinois, a realtor, moved to Manhattan Beach, and he felt that Black people didn't deserve to live alongside white people. He said it would be 100 years before they should be allowed to live next to white people. He said they just are not up to it. So he set out and he orchestrated with the city council a routine by which they would try to rid the city of Black people. And Willa and Charles Bruce were caught up in that. And in 1924, they set out to do eminent domain and take the property under the guise that they needed the area to set up a park. So in 1929, the resort was torn down and the Bruces were relegated to Redline districts in East Los Angeles, where their whole family and their children and their children's children were destined for poverty. Now, they were paid $14,000 for the resort when they sued before they were run out of town. But that was nowhere near the value of what the property should have been. So I'm pleased now that the state of California and the governor has signed into law the process by which we are able to return the property back to the descendants. So 75 million to 14,000, I think it's something that Willa and Charles would be very pleased to see that their descendants will be able to take on that wealth, that institutional wealth that was taken away from them so many years ago. So I'm pleased that I had a small role in trying to make sure that we never, ever forget what happened with the Bruces, because if we do not recognize what happened in the past, we will definitely repeat it. And again, they are our local heroes. And now I think they're the state of California heroes. And I think this whole situation where we're returning the property back over to them, they will become heroes throughout the United States.
Well, not only heroes, but a model for how we can, proactively address these issues and reverse these harms. And so, Mitch, that's a really great transition kind of into the full panel discussion. So I'm going to have everybody go ahead and turn their cameras back on. But I'll start with you, Mitch. I apologize to go to back to back, but I imagine that a big piece of the success of this overall campaign was education of the issue to the wider community, and then bringing them into a conversation about how and why land reparations or this beach coming back to the Bruce family was the correct action. And I would love to hear how you feel education, public outreach, all of those different pieces go into changing hearts and minds that are going to be required for some of these larger policy changes.
You're right. You can't, as I said, you really can't fix something that you don't understand. So it was my job to try to educate people that we did have Black people here in the city of Manhattan Beach that were entrepreneurs, and they were people that we should look up to and respect because they were our forefathers and founding people of the city. And so we'll have individuals here, elected officials, will say, well, you know, the only color that matters to us here in the city of Manhattan Beach is green. If people have green, they are able to buy property, is what they're insinuating. But that's really a lie. It is more important to try to make sure that all people have the equal opportunity to purchase property anywhere that they would like throughout Los Angeles County. And so even people like Willa Bruce with $1,225, she says, I have the money, I'm going to buy the property. She bought the property, but they still wanted to redline her out of there. So we've got to do a lot to try to educate the public about property rights and Black property rights. And I think that will go a long way in trying to change what's occurring currently.
Yeah, and Tara, I feel like this goes into a lot of what you were saying earlier about, you know, the restrictive covenants. We've had a couple questions come through the chat about those statistics. So I think a lot of people are kind of in my boat of not knowing a lot of that. So you mentioned that there has been some efforts to address this legislatively. So can you maybe come at that question through that lens of what we need to do on that public outreach and engagement front in order to encourage the legislature to take some of these more important policy changes on things like this?
Sure, yeah. So one of the things I think we're all learning about is how pervasive these restrictive covenants are. And that statistic was definitely shocking. I will say in my time as an affordable housing developer, which has been over 20 years now, I've seen those covenants throughout California. So I think sometimes people think maybe it's just an urban area. They're everywhere. Actually, in Westchester, I uncovered close to 200 of them. I don't think people realize that, first of all, how many there were and that they're still there. So a couple different things happened. First of all, there was legislation last year that was passed. It's AB 1466, if anyone wants to look it up. And it was Assembly Member McCarty who basically addressed the fact that there are single family homeowners who want to take these covenants off their properties. This is more related to single family homes. So many people, if you go and look at the title to your property, you may find these covenants on there and you didn't even know they were there. So you can actually, as a result of that bill, now remove it officially. Even though the Supreme Court obviously says the racist language is not valid, you can actually physically get it removed. So just follow the steps in that bill. So that was a good thing that happened at the state level. The other good thing has to do with that property I was telling you about earlier. So as I mentioned, I've seen those covenants multiple times throughout my career. And unfortunately, usually what I've had to do is walk away and not develop the properties for affordable housing. When this one came across and I said, this is just a perfect property in a great neighborhood that has no affordable housing, it's time to not walk away and fight back. So my choices were to sue all of the property owners in that tract, which would have been a very costly and risky process, or go to the state and change a law that negated that provision of the covenant. So that's what we did with public counsel. And basically Assembly Member Richard Bloom, who sponsored a bill, AB 721, that basically said, if you've got a property that's zoned multifamily, just like this one was, and there's a racial covenant on there, that also restricts the ability to develop it for affordable housing, that provision is also now negated. So the racist provision is obviously negated, but also you can develop it for multifamily housing. It was a big lift and it involved a lot of housing advocates who were supportive of the bill, but it did pass. So I think it's just a lesson that, first of all, we need to learn more about this. You know, we need to understand where these restrictive covenants were, who were the people that put them in place, and then we need to start fighting back. So that's just one example. There are many examples of things that I've found actually just in Santa Monica. There was an organization called the Santa Monica Protective League that was basically people who did not want to allow Black people to own property or businesses, in particular near the beach. And you've probably all heard of how the Black Americans were not even allowed to go to the beach in Santa Monica, except for one area called the Inkwell. But this actually went further and it was upheld. unfortunately, by city ordinances that basically allowed this to occur. So that's something I personally just learned about within the last few months. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to learn about these things and then figure out how to counteract them, basically.
Awesome. So I'm going to pick on Dr. Orlando if he's still with us and can turn his camera on. But I'm a big data nerd, as I'm sure we've all gathered thus far. But what role does data and the work that folks like you and the wider reparations task force that's kind of gathering some of the work that folks like you are producing, what role does that play in educating the public? And I ask this as somebody who loves to read, but doesn't always have time to read every single book on a topic. And I imagine the rest of the public kind of feels the same way.
Yeah, I think part of it is incumbent on those of us who stare at the numbers to actually tell a story with them. Part of the challenge that I find with a lot of the research is it's great and it doesn't reach most people because it's stuck in an academic journal and it's very technical. So one of the goals of my book was just to be able to tell a story. I have to admit that the book stands on the shoulders of most people. Most of the work that is in that book is not my original analysis. It's my homage to them, finally taking all this work that scholars have done for 50, 60, 70 years, some of whom I actually saw have spoken to the Reparations task force. And I cite them in the book and tell their story so that more people can hear it. But one of the challenges I thought in presenting that material to the public is, in my mind, roughly speaking, there are two groups of Americans. There are people who know the history of redlining, people who don't. And I suspect that a lot of the audience that we're speaking to today are people who already knew some of the history. Maybe some of the data I showed them was new. If so, I hope it gives them more to work with when they go out there to advocate. But the broader public is still sadly very unaware of the issue. You might remember during the presidential campaigns that Elizabeth Warren and some of the other candidates started talking about redlining, and it was shocking to find out how many people had no idea what they were talking about. And those of us who work in housing, it feels like it should be obvious. I think we have to work harder at figuring out what is the medium, what is the platform to getting the message out to the broader public. We're having great conversations here among a lot of people who obviously care a great deal, and it can move the needle, especially in very moving examples like Bruce's Beach. We can do it, but getting the data out to the broader public, I think, is the real challenge, and it's something I'm constantly wrestling with. So I'm open to ideas.
Well, and that's kind of, I'm going to pick on Lisa again and go back to her. I think in my mind, the task force reparations task force plays a role in kind of uniting what Mitch has talked about, what Tara's talked about, of the local efforts, the legislative efforts, and then the overwhelming amount of data that we have that shows these impacts. Do you kind of see the task force in 2023, after all of your hearings and engaging the public, kind of playing that role in those recommendations of bringing together all of those different levels of things that we need to address?
Yeah, that's such an important point and such a salient issue for the task force. We see our work as, one of our goals is to collect the data, curate the data in a way that's very accessible, and then provide this evidence to the legislature with our, as the basis for our suggestions and recommendations for law. But the other role that the task force sees as critical, and something that I believe is fundamental to the concept and the philosophy of reparations, is truth telling. Bruce's Beach is a perfect example of truth telling, of the importance of correcting the record, of the importance of creating a much more inclusive narrative, right? We see that people are uneducated about these basic issues, about things like sundown towns, the restrictive covenants on their own properties, the redlining in neighborhoods that are just down the street from them, completely clueless. And that is because there has been a purposeful white supremacist master narrative that we have all imbibed our entire lives. And that narrative is counterfactual. It is not truthful. It does not tell the truth about racial injustice for the last several centuries. It does not tell the truth about why we have such a massive wealth gap, such a massive education gap, such a massive health gap. What it does is it creates a white supremacist narrative that says the reason why we have these gaps and these disparate outcomes is because Black and brown people don't work as hard. You know, they're not as smart. They're not as able and competent. And that is a racist narrative, but it is a narrative, it is the most dominant narrative. We are still educating our children to believe that. That is the master narrative that we need to be pushing back on. And when we collect this data, we have to think about that master narrative and how we create a framework and a new narrative that is more truthful and more inclusive.
Yeah.
That is our task.
I appreciate that so much, and I could not agree with you more. And it is quite the task that you all have. But based on what I have seen about the task force, I think you guys are definitely up to it. So we could talk about this forever, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time to do Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to just throw this last question out to everybody. Tara, Mitch, Anthony, Lisa, and whoever wants to kind of come out and grab it, feel free. But this hits on a couple of the questions I've seen come in through the Q&A as well, is that, you know, I think what makes Bruce's Beach such a strong light for us to kind of guide ourselves on here is that it wasn't necessarily a halfway replacement of, you know, housing got taken away, so now we're providing you with affordable housing. It takes into consideration a lot of the things that Anthony's research and data shows, is that, you know, housing isn't stagnant, it grows. It's a part of our generational wealth. It's part of how we stabilize families and communities. So, you know, a lot of what we've talked about today has been about affordable housing and the idea of land reparations. And I'm curious for everyone on the group, are those opposed to each other? Is it one or the other? Is it a combination of the two? Does it have to be that we just replace, you know, this idea of generational wealth with access to housing, or does it have to be more acute than that and more focused on the fact that an affordable housing unit is great at stabilizing a family, but isn't necessarily great at helping them build generational wealth for the next generation? So big question to kind of end on, but I feel like I would be remiss to not throw it out to this wonderful group to try to pick at. Don't be shy.
I could start. And so I wanted to share that I volunteer with a group called Committee for Racial Justice. And they're a group of advocates who are really focused on, you know, bringing about racial justice to Santa Monica in particular. But I would just say that, you know, some of the things that that group is advocating for, first of all, is to take a step back and have a more holistic approach to this. So for example, start out with the why. Why is the city now wanting to recognize what happened? And then to acknowledge those things that happened. So the truth telling that was discussed earlier, and then to come up with a comprehensive program that would really be more thoughtful and inclusive of the perspective of people who may have been affected. So one thing that with the CRJ that we're going to be doing is putting out a survey and asking people, what should reparations look like? You know, it sounds like a little bit like a lot like what Lisa's doing on a bigger scale. So this would be more at a localized scale, but it might be something other cities could do as well, is to really ask the people who were affected, what should that look like, instead of us, you know, prescribing it.
Definitely. Mitch, go ahead.
I believe that, you know, educating ourselves on the local level is quite critical, but we have a national repression of Black people in this country, and it has to be addressed on a national level. This includes addressing income inequality. If you have income inequality, it's going to be very, very difficult for people to own a home, and owning a home is where your institutional wealth will be built up. So I think we have to rely more on our national leaders to try to address what is very, very necessary right now about the systemic repression of Black people through covenants, through redlining, and through the banking system in the country today. People just do not want to loan money to people of color. And that's a national problem. And I think once we can address that, then it will help us more on the local level, but starting with educating ourselves about what was wronged on behalf of Black people, and then pressing our national leaders to do more for us, to relieve us from this repression that we have.
Yeah.
And I'll say one thing that I think to add to Mayor Ward's point that helps in that direction is making sure that the voices of leadership who are in the banking industry and are in the regulatory agencies in DC are people who are aware of this issue and are determined to do something about it. Historically, for example, the Federal Reserve has given no thought to any of these issues. They've felt that it's so far afield of their mandate that they shouldn't care. What they didn't realize was their decisions were having these effects, whether they wanted them to or not. And now there is a beginning of a movement to change that. The foreword of my book was written by Raphael Bostic, who was the first Black president in Federal Reserve history. And it's just shameful that it's taken this long for that to happen. But now we're seeing more nominees being appointed who are raising issues of racial justice and economic inequalities. They're being blocked by the senators who should be confirming them, and we need to be speaking up to support those kind of nominees.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you all for taking a big swing at that last big question. So I'm going to try to, in our last 5-ish minutes together, just pull out some questions that we haven't had a chance to touch on yet as a group. I'll try to pitch them to each of you directly, but as always, feel free to jump in. But Dr. Orlando, one that's been sitting here since about 10 o'clock, so I want to make sure we get to it, is a question about, the work that we do tends to serve communities of color. We've talked a lot today about Black Americans, but this is obviously an issue that affects Latino communities, Asian communities, Indigenous communities. And I think, I have struggled with this as a housing developer too, of balancing the need to build in high opportunity areas and high resource areas, and the need to continue a sense of community and a sense of belonging, and oftentimes the safety that comes from these cultures, congregating kind of in similar areas. So, the question is there have you seen any studies or done any research on the trade-offs of disrupting kind of those cultural enclaves versus making sure that folks have access to those high resource areas? Are they opposed to each other, or?
Yeah, this is one of those difficult areas where you can see it quickly getting into a trade-off. And I mean, the hard answer is that it requires both and, right? And that's why I mentioned that quote from Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. It requires both developing in high opportunity neighborhoods and helping people to be able to stay in formerly redlined neighborhoods if that's where they feel safe and that's where they feel that they have a network. And we've talked more, I think, from the supply side of things today, but to Mayor Ward's point about being able to afford home ownership and being able to afford rent, that's on the demand side. And that is a federal issue that Tara mentioned, the waiting list for housing choice vouchers in Santa Monica. Another shameful part of our housing policy, it's just ridiculous that we set a line of eligibility, but then we don't fund enough money for everyone who meets that line of eligibility. And then it's a crapshoot for whether or not you get access to those vouchers. Vouchers should be a fully funded program. That way you can afford to live in a high opportunity neighborhood or a formerly redlined neighborhood. It's giving people the freedom to choose for themselves what kind of life they want. And that's doable if we put the resources to it. And by the way, as an economist, I'll say, we're not talking about unreasonable resources when we talk about something like fully funding the housing choice voucher program. We spend far more money on corporate welfare and other things like that.
Yeah. And then I would love to end with Lisa and Mayor Ward on a question that I'm hoping that two of you can kind of tackle together. And that is a question of historic preservation. We've mentioned, the watering holes that have been a part of the Black community in places all across the country, but also here in California. And, these places represent less than 10% of the historic sites in the United States. And, how do the two of you think that historic preservation advocacy of these places and spaces, as it relates to what Dr. Orlando just talked about, but just, again, the overall approach for public education, reparations, do you have any thoughts on the role preserving that history plays?
I think it's extremely critical that we start to think in terms of Black history as being American history. People like to try to say that we are not as equal to the white history that we read in the books, but we need to start to make sure that our children start to know that Black history and brown history and Asian history, American history here, is equivalent to white history. It's American history. So I think that's the key, is to try to work towards that unification.
I completely agree with that. I think historic preservation is critical to public education, to again, building this inclusive narrative that talks about the contributions to American wealth that all people, including Black people, especially Black people, have made. And so when you look at a town like Allensworth, up near Visalia, and the history of that town, everyone in California should know what that town is and should understand the work that Black people did to build that town, and the way that they were terrorized and the way that town was destroyed, to erode Black wealth. That's our historical legacy, and it must be a truthful legacy. And so, we need to look at these spaces as part of the historical record, and they must be preserved in order for people to understand their history and to do better, and to also be motivated to do the work that it will take to move into a future that's more egalitarian.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is an amazing way for us to go ahead and wrap. We're only 3 minutes over, so I feel like we did pretty good, especially for a topic that we were all probably as a group could talk about for hours and hours. And there's so many things that we didn't even touch on today. But first and foremost, thank you so much to our amazing panelists for giving us so much time and insight into the work that you all are doing. We're incredibly appreciative. And Lisa, I think you're going to have a new group of folks that'll hopefully be on that call with you tomorrow, listening and advocating. We had a little over 200 people here at one point, so that's what I'm expecting to show up on that call tomorrow for her. But thank you again to all of our panelists. I have seen multiple times in the chat today a desire for this to be made available via recording. So we'll work with staff to make sure that is sent out to everybody that participated today. But on behalf of SCAMP and the SCAMP board, I'd like to thank you all for engaging on a critical topic with us today. And just know that this is going to be the first of many conversations on how we make housing, especially in Southern California, a more equitable process. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.